Aloha, everyone. This is Dr. Summer Nicole of SOMA, Women's Collective for Mind Body Healing. This interview has been a long time coming. This is Livia Shapiro. Her and I have been trying to get this interview done for several months now, and I needed to be pretty persistent because Livia, actually, I know you from going to your yoga classes in Boulder at Jeannie Manchester's house. And before that too, it was like in the whole Anusara yoga world and, the Douglas Brooks and like all of that whole world, like when I was living in Fort Collins. And I just remember always like really loving your classes so much, not only for like the advanced, you would do sort of like intermediate advanced asana, but also for just the way that you would deliver yogic philosophy, as well as like integrating the somatic psychotherapy. I just always like, it was so solid, and I always super appreciated you as a teacher. So you've always been someone I remember from my world in Colorado. So I've been wanting to get you on here and share as much of your wisdom as possible. So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm going to share with everybody just a little bit about your bio before we jump in. So Livia brings essential somatic psychology principles and tools to the lives, practice, and teachings of dedicated yoga students and instructors worldwide. So she's practiced and taught yoga for 2 decades now, helping people grow not only through their range of motion and emotion, through their steady asana practice, somatic education, body-centered mentorship, and psychotherapy. And I can attest to this, that you're known for your sincerity, your directness, and your humor. I think that's one of the things I loved the most about you is your directness, because I'm a Sagittarius and I also tend to be very, very direct. And I always appreciate that in people. Let's see, you've done quite a few podcasts speaking to topics around motherhood, somatically based spiritual practices, trauma awareness, and yoga, which I know you teach on quite a bit. And let's see, you work with holistically helping women heal from trauma, repair relational wounds, and rewire the nervous system. So there's a lot here that we could jump into, and just like bravo for everything that you've integrated and how you've integrated it. I always love your posts, and I always read what you write, and you're such a beautiful writer, which you're writing a book, right? Or did you just finish a book?
The book is coming out in November, and it's a book on somatic therapy. A lot of people who sort of track me on social know that I write it's kind of this sort of weird genre. It's basically like memoir and free verse. They're not really poems. They're not really essays. And a lot of people want me to write that book, but that's not the book I got contracted to write. So, because it's really hard to get poetry books published when you're not an actual poet. But since I went to graduate school for somatic therapy, I could write that book. So that is the book that's coming out in November. Yeah.
I'm really excited to read it. So, and I'd love to, we can share how people can access that.
Sure. Yeah.
So we'll just jump right in. We'll get through as many of the questions that a lot of these women want to know. Sure. And so let's just start with the very basics, just in case someone's like super new to this attachment style work. I was just telling Livia, I've been super interested in attachment theory just for my own personal well-being for the last 7.5 years. And it's been absolutely monumental in the way that I am in relationship and seeing my patterns and all that stuff. So how would you explain attachment theory to those who aren't familiar?
Sure. So attachment theory is really the theories, the understandings of how we build our primary bonds of relationship as newborns, infants, very young children, that then become more, what's the word I want to use? Like more informative in the other relationships that we have. So it's like, our earliest attachment bonds, how we are bonded and relate to and get our needs met or not by our primary caregivers. And then that translates into how we have relationships, as adults.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really that essential foundational way in which we connect, bond, and give and receive contact and have needs met in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And what are the, because I've seen it written a couple, like I've seen some of them named 3, I've seen some of them named 4 attachment styles. So how do you read, like, what are the main attachment styles?
Right. So when you really get into the literature, I actually find that sometimes you will see like conflicting terminology, or you're sort of, it almost feels like, I'm like, wait, I think I read it slightly differently over here. So it sort of depends on who you're reading in regards to like the exact terminology. And I don't like to get super hung up on stuff like that, but here's what I'll offer. Basically, we have 2 primary categories. One is secure attachment. Yay, we all want secure attachment. Secure attachment is like, you cry, you're comforted. The care that you have received as a newborn and an infant was safe, whole, attentive, but not invasive, right? And so one of the things that attachment theory is really rooted in is how the primary caregiver and the baby interact. And so when there's this, like, imagine, like, my daughter is now 4, but like, thinking back to when she was an infant, but it's like, let's say I'm holding her and there's this kind of, contact, not just physical contact of the quality that I'm holding her, but then eye gazing and looking away, listening to little, little sounds coming out of her and whatnot. So we're meant to have what's called a co-regulation phenomena going on, where the caregiver is regulating the child, but actually vice versa. That's why we don't like to take babies away from the mother at all. Like, now we know in the birth world, like, as soon as the baby is born, right onto the mother's chest. There should be very little separation, and it's related to that. If the mother is distracted for any variety of reasons, or overwhelmed, what you see is a different quality of holding and attention in the quality of the gaze, the quality of the holding, the way that the caregiver is able to respond to the cues from the child. And that leaves, like, let's say, if I'm like staring, my daughter's name is Olive. Let's say I was like staring at Olive, but she wanted to look away. And she, like, in her body mind, she's realizing she's looking away and needs a break, but I'm still staring at her. That's invasion, invasive to her. And if she's like trying to get my attention, but I'm over here, then that's abandonment, right? And so it's really this capacity of attending. And so in an ideal world, we have what's called secure attachment, where that phenomena is working smoothly. And there are so many reasons why that has hiccups. And we'll probably get into them. But the other thing you see is in children who have secure attachment is that they cry when their primary caregiver goes away. They are clearly upset, but they're able to be soothed, right? Like they're able to kind of self-regulate. They're able to make contact with other people. And then when the caregiver returns, this is one of the hallmarks, they're happy. They go to the caregiver. They're like, yay, my mommy's back, or my daddy's back, or my grandma's back, or whoever it is, right? Mm-hmm. Then we have the whole category of insecure attachment, and that has, details to it. So secure attachment, we say, I would have to go back and check like what the statistic is now, but at least when I was in graduate school, it was roughly 60% of the population is securely attached. 40%,
really? I'm surprised.
40%, right, 40% is insecurely attached. My joke, I've taught yoga for a long time. I'm like, well, that whole 40% is doing yoga.
I only work with the 40%, clearly.
Right. Like, I only work with the 40%.
Yeah.
I'm in the 40%. So
that's shocking, actually, that it would be 60%, because it sounds like it's just so much about presence and, that bond being created, and how overwhelmed and overstimulated most mothers are, like, bringing their child into this world. So it's like, wow, well, Great. Like, that's awesome that there's 60%
Well,
of people.
well, one of the hallmarks of securely attached, one of the things I love about attachment theory, one of the most important, I think, sort of teachings in that theory is the concept of what we call the good enough mother. And the good enough mother is like 80% of the time you do well, 20% of the time you kind of suck. And so long as like 80% of the time you're good,
yeah,
you have more likelihood towards secure attachment for your child than not. And like for me, I find that very soothing. I'm like, okay, I'm only looking for 80%. If I can do 80%, I'm good. Like,
yeah.
I would like it to be more, but obviously I'm a human being. And, and there are so many things that are out of our control. Like I think of how I've shown up as a mother for my young child. And like, there's a lot of things that happened in my personal life that were completely out of my control that impaired my ability to attune to her. And that would fall in that 20%, right? And so, we have these places where we're really trying to repair, repair is always possible. So 80-20 is really the concept that we're working for. And I feel like that translates to so many other areas of our life, right? Like 80-20 when we're talking about like attunement to our partners, 80-20 in our relationship to our students. Like 80% of the yoga classes you take with me will be good. 20% will not be so good. Like that, it could be good enough. And the idea that it can be good enough, I think, is really important.
It just takes the pressure off a little bit too.
It takes the pressure off a little bit. And it gives a broader view. And yeah. So in the category of the insecure attachment, here's where we get into a little bit of, there could be different languaging. I'll start with the one where it's sort of the most common language you'll find, which is not a very common type of insecure attachment, but we call it disorganized attachment. And it's a small percentage, a fairly small percentage of people with disorganized attachment. And you have to have like pretty significant trauma to have disorganized attachment. It's a hallmark of having received incredibly inconsistent care as a newborn, as an infant, as a young child. It's the best way I could describe someone who feels disorganized in their attachment is that they feel very like nebulous. It's like you can't really get a grip on them. They feel, the way I always describe it is like it feels like smoke. It's like, poof, where'd they go? Like, I don't even know where this, like, it's like their energy is just like, oh, I don't even know. They feel very hard to sort of pin down in a certain way. And you can't expect any kind of consistent reaction from them. So that is usually due to a caregiver who was, for whatever reason, extremely inconsistent in their approach as well. And that's usually a hallmark of, trauma. People who are living through we're talking extreme situations. Mm-hmm. Like extreme natural disaster, living in, displaced persons camps. Like you see that coming out of that genre. And I'm actually thinking of, someone very close to me in my life who has that background, and that's their style of attachment.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And like I said, I think the easiest way to really pinpoint it is that they just feel inconsistent. One day they're there, one day they're not there. And there's no explanation why. You don't see it coming. It just is what it is.
And could it also be someone that has like what I've heard termed as diffuse complex trauma, where it's like not like one specific like trauma with a capital T, but maybe they lost a parent and the other parent was completely checked out. And,
yes.
It was like over their years and decades of being a kid, it was just like literally not having anyone that was like emotionally tending to them.
Yes.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. I would say with that, a lot of times in what we call CPTSD, so, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, anytime we have complex trauma in that way, that's very relationally based and attachment oriented, I would say, elements of disorganized attachment are present. The thing that's really interesting about the attachment model is, like, when we talk about the different types of insecure attachment, I like to relate it to the doshas. It's like you have these 3 types, but then we could look at them individually, but then of course they marry to a unique combination within each individual. And there are trends, of course, but you can see sort of threads of different, the different types in someone. But yes, I think what you mentioned is fairly accurate. And not uncommon.
Okay. And what I'm most familiar with, like in my personal life, is the avoidant anxious dynamic, or the avoidant anxious trap, like somebody call it, right? Super familiar with that. Me being on the having anxious tendencies, my partner having had avoidant tendencies. And so I'm curious, like, could you speak a little bit to, like, I guess let's just speak a little bit to, like, the avoidant and the anxious one, right? Great. And kind of like how that trap feeds that, how people come into that. So common.
Yeah. So those are the other 2 styles, right? I said there's 3 styles of insecure attachment. We have disorganized, and then we have, generally speaking, again, the terms can vary slightly, but we would have something called avoidant or dismissive as one, and the other being anxious or ambivalent. And in the avoidant and dismissive quality, you see, or type rather, you see a quality of avoidant children or dismissive children. When the caregiver leaves, they're a little bit like, all right. And when the caregiver returns, they're a little bit like, all right. And what they're doing is they're coping inside. Inside, they're tweaking the F out. They are overstimulated. Like studies that track cortisol levels and heart rate levels, they'll show that, like, the activation is present in the child's system, but they're playing it cool, right? So it's like a coping strategy to deal with separation. And so what they're trying to do is push the person away before they get pushed away, right? Before they get rejected. And that's the coping strategy, to tolerate the discomfort of the separation. In the anxious type, ambivalent, that sometimes you see it as like anxious ambivalent, or just anxious. The child will be distressed when the caregiver leaves, but they're also distressed when the caregiver returns. It takes them a long time to re-regulate. They're basically like exploding out that they are upset that the parent went away, and the child is trying to manage that by making it less likely that the person would leave, that the caregiver would leave. They're trying to almost it's not like a cognitive conscious thing that they're doing, but they want to make it harder for the caregiver to leave again. So they're managing by expressing, whereas the avoidant or dismissive is managing by kind of imploding, if you will, or containing.
Yes. Yeah. And that resonates so much, because it's like, I can see it myself. I'm a very external, like, processor, like nothing's going to be hidden from what I'm feeling. Like, I'm going to tell you about it, like, kind of thing, where the opposite of, like, someone with an avoidant tendencies tends to just do all of their processing internally. Right. And then I've also heard, and tell me if this is true, that with someone who has an avoidant tendencies, because they're like repressing and holding it all in, basically, but that's actually harder on their nervous system.
Oh, I have not heard that, but I believe that could be very true. There's I wonder if it's, I whipped out a couple of my favorite attachment books. Mm-hmm. And there's this one quote that, oh man, it might be in this other one, but it's something like, maybe before we finish today, I can find it for us, but it's such an amazing line. It's something like the dismissive is basically like hiding what they can't tolerate, and the and the anxious is like massively expressing what they can't tolerate, but it's said in a much more kind of beautiful hallmarked way. I'll try to find it before we end, but or I'll find it and send it to you, and you can post it in the notes with this. But yes, agreed to what you said. I think if we are imploding inside, like energy has to go somewhere. And so I can get behind the idea that if someone who is avoidant or dismissive and imploding in that way to cope, that's very taxing on their nervous system, because the energy is just going like in, and there's no chance to get what they need. Whereas the anxious type is like, they are trying to get what they need. It's like it's a little more obvious that something's going on.
It's also been called, I think I remember we did the Hold Me Tight workshop, the Dr. Sue Johnson's work with emotionally focused therapy, and they called the anxious one also the pursuer, and then the avoidant one the withdrawer.
Yes. So like when I was first with my spouse and we would get into an argument, I would be, and I have a fairly decent mix of anxious behavior strategies and avoidant behavior strategies in my attachment. I have a fair amount of both, which is not uncommon, where we'll have a special mix of both. But in that particular dynamic, he would be the anxious one and I would be the avoidant one. And I would literally get up, like we'd be, having some interaction that we got heated. I would like get up and walk away, like walk into our bedroom and just like basically lay down on our bed and be like, I'm done, I'm out of here. He would just like he would follow me around the house trying to finish this argument. And I'd be like,
Tap out, I'm done.
So yes, the anxious one is generally more the pursuer. They need like in an outward way. And it's not like the dismissive person doesn't need, it's just that their threshold of contact has been maxed. Like the anxious one needs contact. And the dismissive one has experienced either so much abandonment or so much invasiveness that's like they're just trying to kind of like find balance and kind of find themselves, if you will.
Yes. And yeah, for me, just from my experience, like of the anxious one too, it's like this need for reassurance. Yes. And like this like need for communication, even like, because that's the worst thing for me. If, the avoidant says, no communication, like I don't want any communication, like I need space with no communication. It's like the worst, because it's like, well, if you just give me even one or two sentences of like how you'd like to take that or what that's going to look like, that space or whatever it is, it's like, it would just calm my system. It's literally like it happens over and over again. Words will just calm my system. And it's like, it's fascinating because it's like, yeah. And they don't necessarily need that kind of like reassurance. And that's kind of how I see that, like how it's shown up in my life a lot.
Or they don't think that they need that.
Right.
Like the needing some kind of, Stan Tatkin, who does a lot, developed a lot of, attachment-oriented approaches to couples therapy. He talks about like that there needs to be a congruent thread in the separation when there's in a couple, in a dyad, there needs to be some like thread of congruency that the individuals can kind of attend to, a tether, right? Mm-hmm. And so we actually like that need to have a few words or to have some kind of like, I love you and I'm going to take 15 minutes, or we can pick this back up when I come back from the grocery store, like some kind of reassurance. That's not bad or like a need that is invalid. In fact, I think we all need that, but sometimes if we haven't been modeled that's okay, it's almost like it gets worked out of us in a certain way.
Mm.
Like we were never modeled that it was okay to have that. Then why would it even register that it's okay to have that?
And then we learn to like not say it and not speak our needs and not actually say what's
Exactly.
true for us, and we kind of lose our voice.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I'm curious, like how does one, let's start with the anxious someone. I like to start saying like I'm secure with anxious tendencies instead of
Yeah,
calling
great.
anxious one. Because I know I'm like coming out of it. So how does one with let's say anxious tendencies or one with anxious attachment style work to becoming secure?
Yeah. So first, let's just say that if you have insecure attachment, it is possible to earn secure attachment. This is what I think is so beautiful about practices like psychotherapy, mind-body practices, any place where you can form, or I'm using replicate in like a mild way, but like replicate a bond where that attachment relationship can get kind of tried by fire again. That could happen in the therapeutic context, that could happen in a relationship, that could happen with a teacher or a mentor. So it's not like, and I don't think the psychotherapists like love that I say this, but I couldn't possibly be the only person who thinks this is true. But, you know, it's not like psychotherapy has the market share on places where you can earn secure attachment. I mean, you can earn secure attachment in a primary relationship, with a partner, with a friend, with a mentor, a teacher, any place where there's like enough contact and enough importance and enough influence where the dynamic can get replayed and then thusly repaired. So just because you have insecure attachment in any way doesn't mean that you can't make inroads towards a more secure bond.
Thank God.
I mean, which I think is like, I mean, hallelujah. I mean, that's like that's the whole name of the game. I mean, it's not, when I was pregnant with my daughter, I was like, she's going to be so securely attached and I'm going to do all the things right. And now that she's 4, I'm like, well, you know what? She has so much content for her therapeutic relationship. This is great. All the places that I have missed will at some point get picked up. You know, it's like no parenting is perfect. No relationship is perfect. We are wired to have what we call rupture and repair. Mm-hmm. So yes, you can earn secure attachment. To answer your question specifically with the more anxious style, what are some of the things? I think you named a really important one, which is being able to first register, whoa, I need contact. That's what would actually take my anxiety down, is some kind of reassurance, some kind of contact, some kind of tether. Mm-hmm. And the first step is even just registering that, because I think what mostly people register who have that type is like, check the phone. Did he call? Did he call? Did he call? Why didn't he call? No. Why is it no? You know, and so first it's going from like that general anxious state in the relationship of like not knowing, trying to figure it out, that sort of mind loop quality to it, to actually going down several layers to recognizing like, wow, I have this need. And my need is to have some kind of consistent or steady contact or tethering, you know, something like that. Often there needs to be more clear boundaries. I find that folks with anxious tendencies, the boundaries are a little bit difficult. They have ambivalent boundaries. Sometimes the boundaries will be like very clear and almost very forward, and then other times the boundaries are super nebulous and fluid and not in a good way. And so there's often needs to be a reestablishing of boundaries, and like they don't know really where they are in the relationship. So I would say it's like contact, tethering, and boundaries are some pretty key pieces there. But if you can't somatically know that that's what's going on, then you're just in this like hyper loop of like anxiety around the relationship.
Yeah. And I've come to know it like as like, if I'm in that state and I feel myself get charged or activated in that way, I feel my nervous system come on like that. It's like what I've learned to do, that I think the quickest way for me to like calm my system is just to go straight to my little girl, because it's like, that is a child ego state, right? Whenever that any of that activation happens. And for me, I feel like I get the relief the quickest if I go straight to like parenting my little girl. And it wasn't always that way. And it didn't always, I wasn't always as aware or could catch it quick enough before I wanted to be like, blah, like on the other person or whatever. But I feel like that has been so huge. Do you feel like, is that like one of the main things you teach, or is that super important when it comes to like healing these and coming to secure attachment, is the inner child work and the reparenting?
I think the inner child work and the reparenting is key, because those tendencies will be present. They might get flared up in a relationship because it's just more obvious, but a lot of times we'll internalize that relationship. Like we internalize the anxious attachment, or we internalize the dismissive attachment, and it's how we relate to our inner child. It's how we relate to our inner self. And so there's a way that we'll be like kind of anxiously checking in some way, or unable to cope in that way, kind of spewing out, or we'll be completely cut off in any number of ways. And so making that link of taking the sort of introjected variant of how these styles show up, and doing that inner work makes you more available to do that in the actual relational work. Mm-hmm. So I think both are important, the inner stuff, and then when you're in a relational dynamic, that you get to play that out too.
And I also had a relationship coach friend of mine say, for the anxious one, it's super important to learn that they learn how to self-regulate.
Yes.
And then for the avoidant they have to learn how to co-regulate. They have to come out of that internal process and actually learn how to communicate their feelings. That really resonated a lot. But when I first heard that, I was like, but I'm alone all the time. Like I have tons of alone time, But I was like, oh, it's the quality of my, like, what am I doing in that alone time? And am I really like tending to like the anxious little girl? And that really made a big difference to me when I learned that piece. It's like, oh yeah, I don't always, it is right. Like I naturally want to co-regulate, but it is that like self-regulation that it's kind of like the piece that you can do without a therapist. It's like you can be your own, medicine, or be your own therapist, like in that way. So that's really helpful. And all of those like super resonate with me, like having to learn how to like connect my power to my voice and speak it, and tending to the little girl and all of those things. And I noticed, and I'll just speak to this for I just noticed, I remember I was like 3 or 4 years into my marriage, and I felt like the avoidant anxious trap was just sort of present again, and it hadn't been present in a while. And I just noticed it's like my attention was always on him. And when it was like hypercritical and mistrusting and doubtful and all these things. And I was like, well, what could I do without him needing to change anything? What could I do like to soothe myself? And what I noticed was that my energy, because we worked in the same house, my energy and my attention was always on him. So I would stop and literally like visualize all my energy coming back into my navel, exhale, ground down to my feet. Sometimes I'd have to do it 50 times a day until I started to, and then I just would take more space. So I had more like time in my own auric field and away from, the influence of his, that's how it's kind of shown up in my life, and how I've been like, okay, well, if I ask him he doesn't even need to change. Like you can do whatever you want kind of thing. How can I take care of myself? And that's been really huge.
Beautiful. I love that. I mean, that's amazing. And that you were able to, not easy. No, not easy. I mean, the anxious type is more, hypervigilant in a certain way, like more relationally hypervigilant.
Yeah, for sure. So how does let's go to the other sides. How does the avoidant one, what are there to become secure?
Well, I think you named an important piece just in what you shared, and in the one before of being able to recognize like, oh, I actually have a need for connection. Like it's actually not okay with me. This thing I'm feeling like I'm saying it's cool, but it's actually not cool.
Yeah.
And really recognizing like, oh, I'm dampening my feeling of that, or the experience of that discomfort, but I actually am feeling that, and speaking that out, risking that it could, that it would be met with whatever, hopefully it will be met with attentiveness and love, but, and so kind of recognize, willing to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And in the same way, kind of working with that inner self and reparenting by recognizing and naming what's coming up and what the feeling really is, and if possible, giving it to oneself. But if not, asking if you're in a relationship dyad for that. Yeah. So I would say that's a really big piece, and where the somatic piece comes in is like, oh, wow, what's actually going on under the surface? I'm not actually cool, calm, and collected.
Mm-hmm. And were you speaking about the anxious one just then?
The dismissive.
Oh, you're talking about the avoidant. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, or avoidant. Just, really being able to be like, wow, there's something there. Like I'm pushing something down that actually needs to come up and out.
It's like just having the awareness.
Yeah. Being able to recognize a sensation, an emotion.
Speak it. And I can just, from my own experience, say it's like, as soon as like the avoidant starts to co-regulate with like purposely trying to co-regulate, it's like, it just calms like the nervous system of the anxious one down, because it's like, and it feels like such work to them, and it seems like that would be such an easy thing, like to the avoidant. Like,
well, and a lot of times when we're dealing with repair, we have what's called cognitive dissonance, in the sense of like, wow, we are expecting that we are going to be missed in any number of ways, and when we finally like receive, right, when the avoidant or dismissive type receives that contact back, and that co-regulation component, it's like, oh, whoa, it's surprising.
Yeah.
That kind of cognitive dissonance is good.
Yeah.
It gives us room to have a reparative experience.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Okay. I'm just going to see how many of these we can get.
Sure.
Let's see. Is it possible to heal trauma or our knee-jerk default settings that stem from trauma?
Yes. But it might take some time.
Yeah. Disclaimer, could take.
Yeah. So I think also in that question somewhere, it sounds like you're also kind of speaking to like how trauma shows up in the bonds of relationship, of linking that back to like the way that we, any kind of knee-jerk reaction relationally that is then tied to some other perhaps complex trauma or relational trauma.
Mm-hmm.
So our brains need to do the things that are like, we just need to be efficient, right? And so we start to categorize, we will build patterns of association, and our brains are wired to do that. And so when we have an impact of trauma that implicates the way that our neurobiology fires, we're doing it to be efficient in our survival strategy. And so the antithesis of that is slowing everything down to receive novel information that creates a level of dissonance to provide room for a reparative experience. So it's really like we're going from, our nervous system is, I think, a lot about Douglas Brooks when I talk about the nervous system and trauma, because like our brain is just, our amygdala all day is like, are you going to eat me or can I eat that? Are you going to eat me or can I eat that? Are you going to eat me or like, am I safe? 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 That's all it does, is just like it assesses danger. Mm-hmm. And if you think about it, that's completely necessary. When babies are born, they are born with an intact amygdala, even though other parts of their brain will develop well into their early adulthood, 26 even. The brain is not fully developed until 26. Wow. And so, but the amygdala is intact, which means that things like birth trauma are directly impacted into the brain. The way that we are held the moment we are born, directly impacted. And amygdala is like, it does not register things in like words or, the reptilian brain does not register like coherent sentences like the way you and I are talking right now. All it registers is basic sensory information and feeling. So like you might not be able to pinpoint like, that thing, like you might not have the words to say that thing was scary, right? That when that person goes away, I feel scared. But somehow when that person goes away, or someone that looks like that person goes away, you feel scared. Something in your body is reacting. Like one of the things I had to work through really early on in my relationship with my husband was my abandonment stuff. And it just so happens that I had a perfect foil for that, because he would go away a lot, because besides from being an engineer, he's a wilderness instructor. So we're talking going away incommunicado, like cannot reach him, like away. And so I would have these like massive surges of feelings of abandonment that were, related to my early childhood experiences with my parents. And it took me some time to tease apart, like, what was him? What was that? And it's not a very cut and dry and clear road, because what's happening is like, it's not, those reactions are not at the level of our front brain. They're in our reptilian brain, which is all like, it is happening so fast, and it's all rooted in sensory information and in quality and feeling tone. So it's like, would show up as like, I get so pissed. I'd be like seething inside knowing that he was going to be going away. And I'd be like so angry, but it would be unnameable. And so I would like pick these fights so that we would be in a fight before he would go away. So then I'd be like, well, good riddance. I don't want you to even be here anyway, because I was trying to make it feel better that I was being abandoned. I mean, it was a huge complex thing I had to work through. This thing was like crazy. It was like, had tentacles and all these different, it was like, I would pull on a string and I'd be like, oh my God. So I share that to say, like, none of this was conscious. I did not have the bandwidth to say like, oh, I think that my abandonment is getting triggered. It just was this like wellspring of emotionality. Mm-hmm. So what makes that go down? The first thing is just slow the whole thing down. It's like everything has to move 100 times slower than your brain is already going. And you have to track sensory information, because that's like Peter Levine in Waking the Tiger, he talks about, I was just putting in a section about that in my book the other night, and he talks about sensations as the language of the reptilian brain. Mm-hmm. And so that's really, when trauma is encoded, that's the level that it gets encoded at. Mm-hmm. It's not encoded at the level of like explanation. It's encoded at the level of feeling and sensation.
It's like Joe Dispenza says, like, the body is the unconscious mind, right? So it's like, you have to tend to the body. It's like always back to the body. It's honestly, it's how I created, even came up with the word soma for my women's skills online. It's just like everything I do, whether it's like somato-emotional release or inner child work or transmuting emotions or trying to access the subconscious mind or all the working with physical pain, all of it is like always comes back to the body. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'm curious, how do you feel, how would you explain it, how somatic work, like what you do, helps to shift trauma patterns that in a person's life?
Well, so let's use the same example, this like abandonment. I feel like a lot of people can relate to something like that. So I can share, from my own experience, one of the things I had to do is track the visceral experience of the fear of abandonment, right? So like fear of abandonment is like it's a concept, but what's the actual feeling?
Panic.
Terror. Or, well, even more somatic is like heat. Right? Burning.
Right, your solar plexus.
Right. So like, oh, I am feeling massive heat in my belly. Or one of the things that comes up for me a lot is in that particular wound is like, I'll feel like I'm getting gutted. Like it feels like my guts are being pulled out, almost like by a fish hook.
I can so relate to that.
And so it's like that kind of quality of being like drained from the inside. Yes. and trying, like, come back. So I would track that. And sometimes you'll get other kind of imagery, like another image that would come to mind specifically for me was like, you have a dresser and you're trying to fit the clothes in the dresser, and the clothes in the dresser are too full. And like, I was like desperately wanting to like just clean out a drawer of the dresser for me to put my stuff in, right? Like the idea of wanting to take up room in the other person's consciousness, which is the antithesis of abandonment, right? It's like you mean more to the person. So that's like you're in you're in their reference, you're in their dresser. They've cleaned out space for you to exist in their psyche. And that for me was one of the deepest pieces in there, and working with that image and that feeling, and just like emoting around that, and so tied into my, relationship with my dad. And I did a whole piece around that. And in sort of mapping that landscape for me, it made it easier for me to be like, for me to offer the places of the benefit of the doubt to my spouse, being like, wow, he's not like my dad in that way. Or like, that's not the same in this wound. Like, that's not actually abandonment. That's him living his life, or, kind of just helping to separate that. So a cognitive way is to kind of make lists of how things are different. This situation is not the same as this situation. Right? My partner is not like my mom in this number of ways, right? This is how this is different. And actually creating separation and dissonance there can help us to see things cognitively clearly, how they might look similar, but they're not actually the same. I think that comes after the deep somatic piece, though, just like being able to track the quality of sensation that is arising in one's body in response to that emotion or to that feeling coming up. Like with the dismissive, example, it's like, can that avoidant or dismissive person come into themselves and be able to be like, wow, actually, if I attend, I'm feeling like violated. My boundary has been crossed. There's too much information coming out. I mean, I'm sort of making this up, but like, wow, my boundary has been crossed. I actually need space, but I need space with connection, or, okay, can I like track that burning in my chest or in my throat or whatever it is. But the way that we somatically track sensation, that is then linked to emotion and need.
Yeah. Everything you said, I'm just like, yep, seen it, yep, yep, that's exactly how it shows up. It's like just registering as you're speaking. Yeah. Okay, ready for the next one?
Yeah, great.
Okay. How do you see attachment embodied in your clients? How do you see attachment embodied in your clients? I didn't write that question, so tell me if that makes sense to you.
Well, I'm thinking about it in a few ways. One is like the patterns that show up in people. And then the other way I'm thinking of it is like actual body posture. So I can kind of speak to both. In terms of like the body posture one, that's not my expertise, only because I tend to be a little renegade and I don't like maps, in the sense of like, I like maps, scratch that from the record. I like maps, but I don't like when I have to fit into the box. Like I don't like the category where it's like, this is what it means. I actually think that we really need to be stay very curious and spacious about what something means for someone, as opposed to being like, oh, your anger is in your quadricep. Like maybe it is, or maybe it's not,
Right.
So, but one of the main tenets that underpins somatic psychology comes from bioenergetics. And in that, Alexander Lowen and Alexander Reich, like or Wilhelm Reich and Alexander Lowen, they were really looking at like archetypes of body structure. So we look at like, posture, and they even had like categories like masochistic and, all these different categories. And there is a way that you could potentially overlay attachment style and body posture. I think that there could be a correlation there. but I don't love going down that route because I would rather ask questions and be in the emotive experience. So that's my answer to that piece.
Yeah.
In relationship to like, how does it get embodied? I actually think about it in terms of like, what do we do under stress? So this is kind of a, I don't know, mildly trite way to put it, but like, I think about, let's say I was teaching yoga and I said to the class, okay, we're going to do handstand.
Mm-hmm.
Like, thus enlists any number of responses in the room. So for the securely attached individuals, they're like, okay, I'll do a handstand to the degree that I can. And they choose the one that they can do. And they're not over there huffing and puffing or passing out. They're just like meeting the challenge, right? And choosing a variation that works for them. Then there are the people who literally leave the room. Yeah. They have to go to the bathroom or they get a phone call or whatever. They have left the building. Right. Then there are the people who are rolling their eyes like, oh my God, I can't believe I have to do this. This is so bad. I'm never coming back to this class ever again. And they're like fidgeting with their clothes and doing all this stuff before there's like this whole big warm up thing just to get into the challenging pose. So, and then the people there's also people who will just lay down on the floor and take a nap. And so in that, we see these various nervous system responses. We see the people who want to find a relational way to engage. Their social nervous system is online. They are engaged. They are feeling themselves and they are engaging with the sort of demand, if you will. And I mean demand, not like the teacher is demanding something, just like demand of their system. Uh-huh. Then there are the people who are so stressed, they've left the building. Those are your flighting people. They have left. Then there's your fighting people. They're the ones who are, over there kind of like this, or they'll actively like ask you why, or they'll fight with you, or, they're getting hot. Then there are people who passed out. Those are your fainters. Then there are the people who want to help. Those are your fawners. Uh-huh. So like we see basically what your system does under stress is probably what it always does under stress. Mm-hmm. And so when I teach yoga, I actually think that's one of the best ways to rewire the nervous system is put people under stress, uh-huh. under physical stress that's safe, Right. I'm not asking them I'm not like doing something unsafe. It's just like a posture. I mean, downward facing dog could be scary for somebody. Yeah. So when we are putting the body under physical exertion, that requires the sympathetic nervous system to come online. And then we get to see how that person's wiring is really played in. But that could show up like, okay, now with Corona protocols, like you go to the grocery store and you have to wait in line, right? Because we're regulating how many people go in. So just track, like you're waiting in that line. What do you think about that? Are you pissed? Are you helpful? Are you engaged? Are you feeling so tired you can't stop yawning? You trying to like cut in line, or you're getting super pissed that somebody cut you off? Like any mild stressor will show you how you actually are. Uh-huh. Like how you do want to go that far. Everything. That I love that saying so much. I feel like it rings so true. I do. Yeah. 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 So that is how I would, you asked like, how does it show up embodied? So that's really what I look for, in clients. Like when I teach yoga, I'm teaching with an attachment lens. Uh-huh. I'm not really, I'm not necessarily teaching like Anusara yoga anymore. When people ask like, what method of yoga do you teach? I'm like, I don't know. I teach like hatha yoga. I teach postural yoga, but my lens actually is attachment. I'm actually looking to be in a dynamic, socially engaged relationship with them. And that means that I'm tracking what is coming up in people's systems and in my own, right? And so I'm really looking for that co-regulation, which is weird in the yoga context because the conversation is not even. You're talking, they're doing. Mm-hmm. So, and I look for the same thing in my clients, right? Like my psychotherapy clients or my mentees, when we're together, right? Like what are they doing when they describe their stress? Or if there's a change in our schedule, how do they respond? Or all these ways that the attachment tethers will show themselves.
Yeah. And I think that's why, like, I just always remember feeling super safe in your yoga classes. And I was always really picky. I still am really picky. I barely ever go to yoga classes anymore because I just am so picky. And I just would rather sit for 3 minutes, listen to my body and do what my body tells me to do. But I just remember loving, when I lived in Colorado, going to classes and to lots of different teachers. But I remember loving your class. And I think that's one of the reasons that I just felt like it was just a feeling of feeling held a bit and safe because of your lens, like, was just more holistic than just somebody who did a 200-hour training or something. So yeah.
Really, and I think at that time, I didn't really realize that's what I was doing.
Yeah, you kind of like unfolded like as you over the years. Yeah.
It didn't really dawn on me until like a few years ago when, I was, especially after Anusara fell apart and I left that system and people would ask like, what kind of yoga do you teach? And it took me like a while to really figure out like, oh, I think that what I'm doing is attachment-oriented education, which is actually like a thing. Like, apparently it's actually like a thing, which I didn't even really know about. But I mean, Parker Palmer talks about this in his books on education, The Courage to Teach, and being in a healthy and open and positively relationally engaged system of education, whether it's intellectual knowledge or somatic exploration, but that really is how we learn the best.
Oh, absolutely. I could see that for sure. Okay, this one I really like. How do you work with people who commonly dissociate during your embodiment work?
Yeah. So first, let's just define dissociation. Dissociation is, that quality where we vacate ourselves. It's that feeling of like, you were driving to the grocery store, but you actually drove to grandma's, and then you're like, whoa, how did I get to grandma's house? Or you are in pigeon pose, and then some amount of time later, you're like, whoa, where did I just go just then? It shows up in parenting. Like, this happened to me this morning. Actually, I was feeling a little like kind of distracted, and I was reading a book to my daughter. And like at the end of the page, I was like, oh, the page is done. And I was like, okay, better like gotta get in here. So that's dissociation, where we're going through the motions, but we're vacant from our body. We have astral projected or somehow split off from what is going on. It is a completely normal and appropriate response to trauma. I don't like when just the word dissociation gets kind of used as an insult for people, which I think in some of our sort of psycho-spiritual yoga sphere, sometimes that happens where we're almost like weaponizing that word, like, oh, that person's so dissociated. We're like, well, they're traumatized, so they're dissociating because you're asking them to do a lot and it's too much for them. So it's a very normal response to trauma, because at the time of impact or prolonged impact, if it was relational and over time, that was your best strategy. So it's just that now you don't need that strategy and you haven't learned the new strategy yet. So in what I have found, especially in terms of teaching yoga and practicing yoga, is for people who dissociate, bringing them back into their felt sense and or into the room around them is critical. And there's tons of ways that you can do that. But what I usually do is so simple. I'm just like, what's happening inside your body right now? It sounds so like obvious, like duh, but that's not necessarily encoded in our language of, bend your right knee, turn your foot this way, like any of the instructions. We're talking much more like, actually take your internal gaze away from the muscular activity and the placement of your limbs and your proprioception to your interoception now. What is going on inside? Sometimes for people, if you ask them what's going on inside, they're actually getting flooded. They're getting overwhelmed by information because they've actually entered a kind of shock state of overwhelm or being cut off. Dissociation relates to shock states where it's like, we might be like stuck out here, or we're stuck in here and we can't make that connection. So for people who are like really far out here, it's like, just bring them back. Like, can you feel like the gurgling in your belly? Can you feel, the heat of your body? What's going on inside your skin? For some people, that's too overwhelming. And so just being like, notice the color of the room. Notice the sound of the music if you're playing music. Notice the air touching your skin. So keeping it like at the periphery of their body can be helpful. And in a public yoga class, you don't always know what's going on for people and whether they've kind of got stuck in or got stuck out. So you can always start off with just like the periphery of the skin is a really good one, or just noticing small details in the room, but just bringing people back into their consciousness. And it's like, it's a muscle. Healing dissociation is like strengthening any muscle. It's like strengthening the presence muscle, strengthening the embodiment muscle. But what you're doing psychologically is repairing safety and trust in the body to be able to do that. And that just takes time.
Right. It's like repetition, repetition, repetition.
And every time, it's like every time you notice you split off, just come right back. Whoa, okay, I'm reading my book reading that book to my daughter. I'm feeling the breeze on my skin. I'm leaning against the couch cushion. Things like that.
Yeah, totally. And I know we're right at the hour mark. Can I ask you one last question?
Sure, please do.
Okay. I know your daughter's sleeping, so thank you so much for squeezing this in during your daughter's nap. So good. Okay. What role does our own attachment to our trauma play in our ability to embody it and transform our trauma-based patterns? What role does our attachment to our trauma play in our ability to embody it and transform our trauma-based patterns?
I think that's the trash truck. So I think in that question, you're using the word attachment, not necessarily in the attachment style, right? But like,
I also didn't write this question, so I'm curious too. I'm like kind of reading it. I'm like, what role does our own attachment? I think it sounds more, it's like the attachment we have to our trauma, the attachment we have to maybe our stories or whatever.
Right.
Yeah. How does that play in our ability to embody it and transform our trauma-based patterns?
Yeah. There's a really good book that just came out on the market by one of my mentors. Her name is Arielle Schwartz. She's a wonderful therapist in Boulder, a well-known therapist, and she's a great writer. And her new book is called The Post-Traumatic Growth Workbook. And she talks a lot about that in her book of like, anyway, so just a resource for all of you out there. But I guess my shorter answer would be, or is, trauma eviscerates us from our life. It sends us into exile. And so if we have very early childhood trauma, there is this way in which it's like, it has torn us from some of our most innate, ingenious, and intuitive fabric. And it's like, it's so early that we don't even realize that that's how we're living, like, how in, like with plantar fasciitis, we get that pain in the bottom of the foot because the fascia has moved away from the rest of the tissue. Or like if we have a tear at the hamstring or attachment or something, it's like, there's too much space. When there's too much space in like the fabric of our soma and our psyche and our soul, we feel pain, and trauma rips that apart. And so early childhood trauma has this feeling of like, we don't know any different. It's like we're living in this exiled state from our inherent nature. And it's like, it's so normal that it's shocking how normal it is. And only until we get, whatever age, like we have some sort of coming of age moment, or we go to college, or we have some relationship that's awakening that we're like, what the fuck? And we're like, wow, I've been living so far away from myself. And we have this moment of awakening, and then we engage that process of like, I'm going to repair that or return to that. Then there's trauma that's like singular, right? An event or something, where it's like you're living your life, da, 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 and then all of a sudden there's before the event and after the event. And when we have that, it's like you are eviscerated from your life as you know it, and you cannot go back. No matter how hard you try, every ounce of your being is going to try to go back to the previous version, but you cannot. And how are you going to relate to this part of yourself that has died and is dying and is going to be transmuted? And how are you going to relate to this part of you that's birthing and rising from the ashes and into something that you cannot see? I mean, Martine Prechtel writes about this, and The Disobedience of the Daughter of the Sun is a wonderful myth of how to heal from like when you are eviscerated from your life and you have to transmute your life. Toko Paterno writes about this in her book Belonging, which is an exquisite book about like psychosomatic spiritual exile. If you are attached like you can't let go of the person before, you'll probably suffer more, right? Or you're attached, like you can't let go to like, it has to be this way, you know, you'll probably suffer. There's a way in which we have to stay, I think, really curious and open and available to what is emerging, what's dying away and what's emerging. And we have to be willing to be reborn. That said, I mean, you work with a lot of women and a lot of moms, and there's this sort of, I think, kind of misogynistic framework out there that's like moms sometimes, like we have like a chip on our shoulder or something, like because we gave birth to the kid or something. Like that's really a cultural paradigm, that there's no space for the transmuted, transformed mother, more so than it's about like that the person can't let go of like their maidenhood or whatever. It's like that's actually very culturally ingrained. And I think a lot of times when we're looking at like a systems perspective, let's say someone has experiences trauma, but they're really in a family system, if the system is demanding that they stay their old self, that's not going to work. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's like letting go of, I mean, you have to grieve the old self. A lot of like postpartum depression and anxiety, like where do new moms get to like grieve the fact that they're not ever going to not be a mom? Because it's nice sometimes to not be a mom, because then you can do what you want.
Yeah.
But then all of a sudden you have a baby and you're like, oh, well, I'll never do what I want ever again until this child is 20 years old. That's hard, that's like needing to grieve that. Or when you get married, and it's like, wow. Or even when we enter into a significant relationship, it's like we grieve that single self. Where are we allowed to like grieve the past? Or we grieve we need to grieve the young child that like had to accept those terms in order to survive. I mean, that's the most insidious thing about childhood trauma, is that you have no other choice other than to agree to receive the abuse, because otherwise you'll die because you were dependent.
Yeah.
And like, just like having so much self-compassion for that part of yourself, that's like, wow, I had no other choice. Now I have another choice.
And to have forgiveness, I found, is such a huge piece of, when you finally realize like, good, I just abandoned myself a lot in that relationship, or I didn't speak up for myself at all, or I totally gave away my power there. It's like so much self-forgiveness and compassion for, like the little one inside that was like doing their best. And I feel like it has so much to do with compassion and empathy and unconditional love.
Yeah. And we can get really like kind of crystallized, I think, in our identity of being a wounded person or a traumatized person. Uh-huh. And it's like, what is it that we need that part of ourselves that's attached, that's clinging, that's holding on to that identity? What does that part of us need so that we can actually let go enough to expand our identity a little bit more? A lot of times it's just that scared, tender place inside holding on to that identity needs something actually from us, needs some kind of compassion or forgiveness or support or, fill in the blank.
And I found too, when I first started doing like the reparenting work, I was like, I found myself like, and it's usually never convenient, right? Like when you're triggered and like, and you're like, oh, I need to stop and do inner child work. It's pretty much never convenient. It's almost never convenient. But I was finding I was getting annoyed, frustrated, and impatient. And then it was when one of my friends was like, write down like what your dad and mom's parenting qualities were, and it was like those exact qualities. And I was like, oh my God, I'm literally like modeling like how I was tended to, or how I perceived I was tended to. And so it was like this, amazing like process, I guess, of like trying to reach for this kind of evolved way of parenting that I was never modeled.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, we imbibe that modeling, and we introject it, and we make it kind of our own inner self-talk. And we have to make some big choices around how we're going to actually do something different.
Yeah. And it's all like, I think when it comes down to it, at least in my experience, it all ends up being like such a process of building your capacity to be present and building your nervous system's capacity to tolerate discomfort and tolerate pain without reacting, right?
Yes. Yes. I mean, that's, I would say, at the core, at the essence is like, presence is really the, like the nourisher to embodiment, and being able to tolerate discomfort. Those are kind of like they go hand in hand. They're related. They're in a family. Presence, the capacity to self-regulate and tolerate discomfort, and embodiment, they're all sort of informing one another. And I remember when Olive was a baby, and I was really watching that dynamic with a lot of awe of like, whoa, we will stop at nothing to get our needs met. How amazing. That is fascinating. Until it will never be met. And then you see this like whole dynamic of like watching the child, like, try to self-regulate, watching the child kind of like collapse, watching the child almost like have this sort of weird thing that's like almost despair, like accepting that it won't be met. I think that that's why the cry it out method with the sleep training is so controversial. But you really can see that function in babies, like how they're trying to learn how to self-regulate, and how much we do need co-regulation. And when we're met in a consistent way, not necessarily, it's not that we have to be met all the time. It's just that we have to be met in a consistent way. So like the times that we're not being met are also consistent. So it's like what's more damaging to attachment bonds is inconsistency.
Yeah.
And so all of that really informs our ability to stay present with ourselves and with other people. And if you're awake to it, you can really track it in the little kids, because it's unencumbered. It's easier to see it in the kids because it's unencumbered. When you're watching it in adults, it's sort of like, oh, you got this layer and this layer and this layer. It's just messier.
Yeah. Olivia, I just want to thank you so much for doing this.
Sure.
And I'm curious if there's any last thoughts that you would like to leave, like about your work, about like your takeaways personally of doing this, anything, if anything pops through, and it's fine if not, and your website, and I'll leave it in the links here, ecstatic unfoldment, right? .com.
Yeah.
Unfoldment.com. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the attachment work is really at the root of everything. Because it's how, as human beings, we're dependent on relationship. There's something very, just how we're wired. We're wired for connection. We're wired for relationship. And both with ourself, I would say we're wired for relationship with ourself, with others, and with spirit. I think we're wired for all three of those or spirit, but spirit also being like the earth and we're wired for all three of those capacities in very deep ways. And there's so many ways that those get interrupted or truncated or harmed in some way. And that really just opening that up just really helps us be fully human and fully who we are. And so I think the attachment work is really critical to kind of everything, honestly. It's the root. It's the root.
It's the root of like our behavior, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of like free attachment quizzes online. Is there one that you like the best?
Oh, no, there isn't one I like the best.
I have one from the Hold Me Tight workshop. That's actually
I don't, there isn't one that I like the best or not. I mean, like I mentioned before, I think it's similar to like when you take a quiz on like what dosha are you. It's like we can look at them in sort of their singular description, and then there's the way that it really is unique to you and the tendencies that are within you, both based on like your neurobiology, but also what was modeled to you that you then mimic and copy and encode. And so, yes, great to like have that intellectual knowledge, but I think that understanding your own inner map and sort of inner organization by way of the somatic tracking is really the key.
Yeah.
I would like, I like to marry that sort of intellectual and archetypal. It's also nice to think of the attachment strategies or types as archetypes and like to understand those as the archetypes. And then we're tracking our own inner experience and the ways that we relate to the world, and we're corresponding them in ways to get reflection. So, yeah. And yoga and body work and all the stuff that you do and that we do is really related to that.
Yeah. And it's kind of how I love how you just spoke to that, because it's actually how like I kind of have formed Soma, is like these interviews being like the intellectual education piece. But then when we meet in our 90-minute women's circles once a month, I take them through a somatic emotional release meditation, and this one will be tailored specifically for like attachment styles and stuff. So actually going in and doing the work, and what I found, the message was, actually do the work in a group, like create a coherent field in the group, and it's actually going to be more potent and powerful that way, even though it's online. And I've definitely found that to be true.
Great.
Yeah, it's been really cool to watch the women come together and like do the work together, and then just almost like this practice of speaking what's true for them, for this practice of being heard and being seen, and also practice of intuitively listening to other people, learning how to hold space and kind of guide them into more of their process through reflections and questions and stuff like that. So it's a bit of what like Soma is about. So thanks for speaking to that. It's perfect. And so thank you so much. I really have such like respect for how you deliver information, like just your so I'm really excited to read your book too, and just the way that you're able to kind of integrate and express like all of these modalities is really quite remarkable. And so I just give you a lot of credit for showing up, and especially doing this the way that you teach yoga, and doing this in a group, like through a lens of what you have, is just so valuable and holistic. So thank you for doing what you do.
Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you so much. I know we totally went over time, and
that's fine.
I know people are going to eat this interview up. So thank you so much for spending the time. And I will make sure to link everyone to all of your website, and maybe we can put a little information about when your book is coming out. What's your book called?
The book is called The Somatic Therapy Workbook, and then it has a long fancy subtitle. It's actually available for pre-order on Amazon. Like if you...
Oh, great. So I can put the link.
Yeah, I'll give you the link.
Perfect. Okay. So we'll put all that stuff in the links for you guys. So thank you so much, Livia, and everybody have a beautiful day.